Why hello, I wanted to make this video to note what games were interesting enough that compelled me to buy them in 2025. I'm the type of person who takes an extraordinary amount of time thinking whether a game is worth the time investment or not. As I grow older, the more I appreciate going into things blind and especially checking out things that aren't as popular. So, with 2026 nearly upon us, if you want to pick up something that perhaps challenge your perspective, or if you like delving into completely new or untreaded territory, this is probably the video for you. This is coming from someone who likes discovering games for what they essentially do as interesting or fun, as the phrasing goes. Anyhow, if you disagree or think otherwise, let me know, as perhaps I missed out on something about the experience itself that would warrant replaying it. Right, the first on the list is Monster Hunter Wilds, as it was one of my most anticipated titles. It's alright I suppose, given that I'm very biased towards the series, given I played like 7 of the titles at this point and have far too many hours in it. The thing is, I'm very partial to games that are technically competent, and unfortunately this was not one of them, at least prior to Title Update 4 or nearly a year after launch. So a general thing I like about Monster Hunter is that they always try to metaphorically reinvent the wheel for every successive title. Although gameplay looks similar to one another, the actual handling and how you engage with new and old mechanics feels fresh. Wilds, however, kinda misses the marking a little for me, as although there are many new things, the overall impression it gave to me is that their other titles offered a more full and encompassing experience that was far more tightly designed. One thing that stood out to me is that they mentioned an intentional shift away from Elder Dragons, or the big bad walking environmental hazards, which there are only 2 in Wilds, to make ecological considerations and middle-of-the-pack monsters more of the focus. Yet, a common complaint is that there aren't enough monsters, as this game has a rather small roster, so yeah. Anyhow, what I dislike the most about the game is how rather uninteresting skills are and skill diversification is, given how Sunbreak had so many cool ways of engaging with the game, but that was more of a B-style game which they experimented a lot more with that kind of stuff. Still, skills like Adrenaline Rush made it into game, but I'd like to see stuff like Status Trigger, as status weapons are not that useful, as the Foray skill, also from Rise, isn't that great by itself. I think it's actually the case that there's the least amount of skills I believe in this game compared to other Monster Hunters, and it feels like some of them were put there just as placeholders really. As someone who plays 9 of the 14 weapon types, I gotta say that some of the weapons definitely feel less viable than others in the context of how fun or engaging they are. The game definitely suffers from that pre-expansion lack of refinement, as balance considerations are not as tight and hopefully will be later. Regardless, I think the expansion will have to do some serious major heavy lifting this time around. As overall, the base game is okay, and what you can expect if you are playing a Monster Hunter, but without the element of surprise or well thought out design that you'd normally expect. If you've never played a Monster Hunter before, I'd recommend World or Rise as a better first impression instead. What small amount of content that exists here is stretched beyond what is reasonable, arguably, as their previous way of doing things doesn't really work with less in the game. Even being somewhat biased, I'd give it a 7 out of 10. Tainted Grail, The Fall of Avalon is a AA first-person RPG that is probably one of its only kind in making a Bethesda-style Elder Scrolls-like game. Although I don't really like Bethesda games as much as other people, and I like Fallout a lot more too. My taste has changed, however. I'm very much fond of high fantasy and the like more now. I wouldn't say it exactly scratches that itch of sandbox environmental storytelling or overall charm that Bethesda games are known for, but it does its own thing with Arthurian mythos and fusion with other game ideas like Souls-likes. I was actually really hyped for this game from its initial announcements around 2021 or so, as I played their other Tainted Grail game, a card game, and look forward to any and all news posts of what they're up to. For me, the game has that charm of being rough around the edges, but I feel like the game loses focus the further it's developed. If I had to find a major fault, it is with how quests work, as the writing and how the game establishes a story later on is rather contrived with the same sort of lengthy expositions for every important character you meet. The game's quality dips significantly by Act 3 in my opinion, as I think that only 20% of players getting to the last act is pretty telling that most people didn't bother, as what is there isn't exactly foretelling of a big and amazing finale, though it's always the case that not many people will make it to the end. Don't get me wrong, I think it is fun, but when I think of the potential the game had, it can seem kinda sad that they didn't go further, as many elements of its design are not expanded upon. Also, as with many games these days, the launch period always seems to be the worst experience, but I'm sure the game is in a far better state by now. Nonetheless, I applaud the effort, as it seems like this is their first foray into a project of this size, and even if it feels like in the end it was held up by bubblegum and tape, I'm looking forward to what they're making in the future. They recently introduced paid DLC, and the game itself is still being worked on and being fixed from what I can tell. 6.5 out of 10. Ah yes, Silksong is in part the I want to pull my hair out type of game. No, not necessarily because of the bosses, but because of the platforming, as I really don't play these kinds of games. It is interesting too, as I was able to restart and beat the original Hollow Knight after giving it up for over 5 years in about 20ish hours to get myself settled in just before Silksong's release. Actually, just the day before, and when nobody could buy Silksong for several hours after release anyway. Like many games, if you just sit down and take the time to understand what is what, then it really isn't all too bad in terms of difficulty. Of course, that depends how busy you are to commit yourself to it. It takes a good approach of balancing the use of strategy, input precision, and reaction time. But yeah, it's definitely up there in traditional difficulty of older games and really stretches the limit of what I thought was possible for myself. And I'm all for that, as it really captures that flow sense just as well, if not better than what you get from most Souls-like games. At points, however, I felt like it was more tedious than difficult. Unsurprisingly, like many others, this is one of my favorite releases of the year. Though it isn't my favorite release this year, as that goes to Hades 2. That game's still my intention instead, as its release date was on the same month. By the way, my game of the year. I would have put Hades 2 as a separate listing, but I bought it at the moment it was available in early access on May 6, 2024. Not saying Silksong isn't game of the year material, as it offers its own kind of a one-of-a-kind experience, but I like how Hades 2 offers a more fuller experience. Silksong is incredible for its exploration, lore, bosses, and hand-drawn aesthetic, but it definitely is a fine needlepoint of what it delivers. Overall, I think I like the original Hollow Knight's level design a bit more comparatively and on how you approach areas. The original feels a lot more interesting in its Metroidvania design in terms of finding and utilizing new abilities, whereas Silksong felt more like a straightforward action adventure for the most part. It could just be me just getting more familiar with how they do things, but that's how I felt about it. Easily a 9.2 out of 10 game for me. I've played a bunch of Souls games, but Khazan the first Berserker is quite the surprise. The game did the deluxe edition gives you early access to the game in advance kind of trend, and I noticed great reviews from it and decided to buy it after it officially launched. I figured of all things, a Nexon published title that is just a straight up character action game that isn't a always online and or pay to win gacha sort. And sure enough, I agree wholeheartedly with those initial reviews that this game does action incredibly. The game is more similar to Nioh than it is to Dark Souls, and while not having as many inputs for its action gameplay, it fits nicely in between leaning more on a traditional character action game than FromSoft's style of gameplay once you get a hang of it. It is much faster paced, and the use of movement between blocking, dodging, and using abilities felt really awesome. It is that really fun case of dissecting the boss's moveset that requires adapting your playstyle to fit their actions in a more interactive fashion than the classic roll spam sequences that is common in, say, Dark Souls 3 or Elden Ring, as you may deflect, iframe dodge, or unleash special actions based on what the boss is doing. It is especially like Nioh in the way that you obtain gear and loot similar to ARPGs, grinding for boss materials to craft gear, and rerolling gear once you find something you like across the 3 weapon types. Mix and match various armor set bonuses to take your combat experience further. I will say that the story and background elements are just rather okay at best, as it shares that mission structure being like Nioh and being loosely stitched together and repeating maps that you can clear. This is one of the few games that have 100% of the achievements, and I enjoyed suffering through the final boss immensely, as it took 2 hours or so of some serious concentration to lock in and optimize. I heard that they changed around the difficulty of the game and nerfed the bosses a bit and whatnot, so while the experience won't be exactly what it would have been like at or near launch, it still is quite the good game. I think the game could have used more enemy types and more interesting dynamics, but I'd still say it's worth the time as I got 45 hours out of it. I'm hopeful that they will release new content or an expansion or something for the game. 8.4 out of 10. perhaps not a new game in itself, but Cultic Chapter 2 is a DLC follow-up as a whole new campaign following the events of the first chapter in a way that can be considered a new game by conventions of how older shooters separate experiences through the idea of a chapter, often in the case of 3. I have an immense soft spot for boomer shooter style of games, as I really like both pixel art, but more so that early 3D polygon look that you get from games like Quake 2 and the like. So this game takes the best of both worlds, as characters are sprite based while the environments have that early 3D look to them. If the first chapter of the game is all about a well placed romp within reasonably contained maps as you keep progressing forward, then chapter 2 is more like a widespread map with things placed about, so you have to travel back and forth much more as you tackle what to do and how to approach the objectives. In a way, I actually like chapter 2's approach a bit more, as it leaves a larger degree of player agency and allows the developer, yes, it's a solo dev game by the way, to do more interesting things than the safer standard idea of a retro FPS. Also, finding weapon upgrade parts to upgrade your arsenal is really neat, as it was in chapter 1. However, I do have criticisms. A lot of the fights include longer distance engagements, as you can see even in the initial level of the game. Doesn't really work as well in my opinion, as I can barely see enemies over distance, and the bloom on weapons is likely to cause you to miss, whereas enemies are always quite accurate. While I also don't mind walking around and examining the new level design elements that are available, I did get a bit lost at some points, as it really is that old school type of finely combing the area to know how to proceed at some points. Nonetheless, it does break up the pacing similar to chapter 1, as it has things like minigames, enemy standoffs, boss fights, and the like to make it worth the time. Some elements may not age well for repeat playthroughs however, as segments of spooky moments, jump scare scenarios, enemies spawning behind you, and the like seem like first time only type effects that don't really work once you understand where and when they occur. Alright, I did play on hard mode, which is only the third of the 5 difficulties, and I gotta say yeah, it's pretty darn hard at points, and I think some enemies might have a little too much HP. Nonetheless, I enjoyed my time with it, as I do like retro shooters a lot. 8 out of 10. Metal Gear Solid Delta is Konami's foray back into the AAA market with a remake of one of the most iconic games it has ever published. My experience prior to it was the 3DS port of the game of all things back around 2017, so it probably wasn't the greatest way to experience it. In any case, the experience is largely intact as it attempts to be faithful to the original but with enhanced graphics. A major issue I have is whether people will have the hardware to run it, as it's probably the most demanding title on the list other than Monster Hunter Wilds and another one I'll mention later. The game itself isn't exactly one-to-one however, as you may select between the 2 camera modes that alter how AI functions. The new style is definitely different gameplay-wise, as it simultaneously is too easy as aiming is far too easy, and incredibly so with a mouse, but AI will notice and spot you way faster in the modern mode. Overall, I can see why people largely believe this is the best MGS game, as its gameplay moments are still fresh and amazing 20-something years later. I think however that the cutscenes back then were a lot better due to how the design elements and direction that don't hold up as well for photorealistic graphics. 8.5 out of 10, as while it doesn't introduce much new, it is still an experience worth playing, especially if you haven't played any of the other renditions. So having only played Silent Hill 3, this was my second look at a game in the series, and wow, it's yet another Konami title in 2025. I'm curious as to why they decided to release 2 large AAA titles in less than a month away from each other. But yeah, this one was alright I suppose. The art design of capturing the countryside and specifics of a 1960s Japanese town seems pretty well done, as the environments and how the game presents its settings are incredibly distinctive. The way that it presents its strange and foggy tale definitely has that unsettling sense of being eternally lost in a way that does remind me of my experiences with the third game and what I've seen of the other Silent Hill games. Since the setting mirrors the relative impressions and states of being of people and their thoughts, the gameplay doesn't include firearms in the sort, which is cool, so it must work around that issue instead. But I must say, I don't like the combat, as it seems to be detrimental to the experience overall. If it is the case that the setting and the story dictate the way in which people may reasonably fight or defend themselves, then surely it means that the melee combat should be more fleshed out. And it kinda is, at least in how it approaches level design, as many encounters are designed in a way to promote close quarters combat scenarios as you would expect. Unfortunately however, that doesn't seem to be the case for actually how weapons themselves handle, as it mirrors older Silent Hills in this stiff, unresponsive way. Attack commitment locks you in place. While it's definitely a choice to do so, I don't like it here for a third-person over-the-shoulder camera game. How basic and boring the combat is heightened by the first real boss fight of the game. It took far too many hits while not necessarily being all that interesting or dynamic, as the responsiveness of the controls aren't as tight as other action games I've played. I also did play the game with the combat set to hard mode, and I thought other than the reactive dodging aspects and critical attack inputs, the game's combat is more of a chore than something fun or interesting. That's great for incentivizing survival horror, I suppose, but if the game's only choice is generally fighting through melee, then it's a bit conflicting for me. I haven't finished the game yet, but I did play it for about 5 hours or so. They did rebalance the game a bit from some of the patches I've seen, so I'll probably get around to it. I can appreciate the technical efforts of what it tries, but it's a 6.5 out of 10 game for me. Switching gears, I love card games. I only started liking them more when I picked up Magic the Gathering only this year actually, as while I did play popular ones like Slay the Spire and Balatro prior, they were not really my idea of fun. But yeah, although still being new at these roguelike card games, I really enjoyed this one. I have seen the first game but didn't decide to pick it up as I figured why not for a new release that according to most people is better balanced than the first one. So yeah, roguelike card games. If you like Slay the Spire, you'd probably like this one too. One of the things I really like about this game is choosing a sub-leader card in which you have unique builds as you can mix and swap between a main unit and the sub one for lots of combinations. The routing of runs is really cool too, as you could choose between upgrade paths. I found that there is less downtime and more actual gameplay in this compared to something like Slay the Spire, as it smooths out some decision making as you pick between 2 routes for upgrades and there are no choices for the next battle encounter. Furthermore, the game still appears to be updating, so if you like games with more content over time, this is great, although I'm looking forward to Slay the Spire too. However, I don't like the art for Monster Train 2, as the art direction feels a bit out of place for some characters in the overall look, as it simply looks like another Hearthstone-esque game, but I can overlook that if the game itself is fun. About an 8 out of 10 for me. Our creators, you've probably heard, seen, and likely played or watched extensive gameplay of this hot new extraction shooter. I really like how well the game's audio design is implemented in how you approach the game, and it is one of the only games where I know who is coming where, how far, what weapon they're firing, and the like immediately just by the sound design. This was also another game I was interested in by the positive impression of others trying it during its beta and server slams, and if it was rated well enough at launch, I would pick it up. That indeed happened, as it had something like over a 90% positive from 10k reviews, so that was enough for me to take a plunge at it. Anyhow, I gotta admit, I wasn't sold by the third-person perspective gameplay at first, especially its PvP, but the more I played it, the more I realized how the design decisions that make up the game actually work for its own unique and polished experience. Though, getting blasted by meta weapons isn't all that great either though. Also, animation desync, as the problem seems to be the case as with Embark's other title, The Finals, is a massive issue, so if you're the type that cares about how fair or reasonable you can react back to some scenarios, this game might not be for you. Also, being an extraction shooter, your mentality of gear and loot should be loose and fleeting, but unlike other games of this genre, it's pretty easy to obtain the pack. Experiences differ, especially in the context of a multiplayer title, and particularly with a lawless topside in which players create their own experiences. I'd still say I had more positive experiences than bad ones, as most people weren't willing to PvP on site, at least at launch. I somehow busted on some kind of transaction in which one guy was holding 12 lemons for whatever reason. I couldn't resist shooting them. But recently, I had an experience which I outgunned a 2 group when my teammate got immediately dropped, as they were camping something fierce and unexpectedly got the drop on us. That was a great highlight. The game is kinda empty feeling, however, other than upgrading facilities, so I'm curious how the game will retain its player base, as its honeymoon period is about here for most people to realize what's what. Easily experience of its own, as its multiplayer nature makes it a bit different than the rest of this list, but if I'm talking about the experience as a whole, then it's a whole roller coaster. Never gonna get a queen kill, however, if all the experiences on social media are to be believed, but I still like playing it. 8.4 out of 10. I really like the soundtrack of this game. Right. The game itself is really good, but I actually don't like its combat gameplay as much as other JRPGs I've played, as while Expedition 33's is a step above something like a Dragon 7 and 8, I still don't like it as much as I do with, say, like Atlas stuff. Anyhow, it's good, and I really like wandering about the overworld to see what kind of things that the developers put in the game. I have to say the experience playing it feels a bit less structured, as its more open aspect means that players will approach what is available differently, and that is definitely a design decision at the cost of deliberation that JRPGs usually thrive off of. This is of course a matter of taste, and I don't mind it, as exploring around feels really nice as it's trying to be something different, and it does come off as not as well polished however. For instance, a common issue I had was due to optional content being too high level initially, I would come back after forgetting about it due to the nature of the game having too many things to do, and would stomp them as it was a non-challenge. At launch, there were no challenge modifiers I believe, so yeah, there isn't much for me to say about it other than if you like JRPGs, you'd probably like this one. The free upcoming DLC is nice that it expands some details of the less touched up upon elements of its story. 8.8 out of 10.
I just finished my sculpture of the legendary Esquier. This may be my life's finest work, yet not a single soul seems to care.
Sometimes I feel sorry for her.
Who? The paintress?
Look at her. She looks sad. Maybe she's a prisoner too, stuck in the same cycle with us. Silly her.
Only you could choose empathy at a moment like this.
It's one of the few choices I can make.
I couldn't do it.
It's okay. You don't have to.
WUCHANG Fallen Fetters is definitely an underlooked Souls-like that is absolutely a hidden gem, at least for English-speaking countries, as only 6.8k of the 98k Steam reviews are in the English language, as most of the traction seems to come from China and East Asian countries. As some people will point out, this game actually resembles something more akin to Dark Souls 1 than to modern Souls-likes, as its slower overall pace and excellent environmental design fleshes out the world. The combat is definitely not as well polished as other titles, as some hitbox and general design feels a bit jank. Still, I appreciate that it attempts a slower pace when all these games try for more speed, as this game uses far less magnetic tracking than say Elden Ring. Positioning as a tool therefore matters just as much in maintaining an edge over enemies than simply iframing, which this game also has plenty of. Some of its influences are a little bit on the nose however, as there is a not Radon who is massive, fires purple arrows, and dual wields large blades, but man, I love the exploration in this game. There are so many unique paths and little design elements that makes it worth the effort to explore everything you can in my opinion. However, if you don't like Souls-like games, this game likely won't dissuade you from the tropes and general mentality required to play them. There are rather cheap or frustrating moments if you don't pay attention to your surroundings, and ganks aplenty. The game's mechanic of repeatedly dying, increasing your damage dealt and damage taken, will expedite the process of the Souls trial and error style of gameplay. Similar to other Souls-likes, the story beats and questing is rather cryptic, though more helpful here as you're informed of new dialogue and location of NPCs, but it is even more confusing overall if you don't understand the historical context of the game. Speaking of which, I know that the patches altered the story and most importantly, changed the game to be easier, which is a shame given that Souls-likes are all about tackling things that you thought were initially insurmountable. I mainly played most of the experience at its launch period, but I need to return to complete the game. Nonetheless, I think it's a fairly competent game that got lots of hate initially, especially for its optimization or lack thereof, nerfs, and altered story, but try it if it interests you. I went in blind and enjoyed my time with it. I wouldn't say I liked it more than Khazan however, as I would rate the experience I had about 7.5 out of 10. Finally, here are some other titles I've already made videos about. You got RAIDOU Remastered, Absolum, and Kingdoms of the Dump. I've covered these games in more extensive videos, but I'll go over them really briefly. I really like RAIDOU Remastered. It has that Shin Megami Tensei flair with a more lighthearted role of Persona, as its position as something between is intentional if the second game has anything to say about that. In any case, the remaster is more like a remake in how extensively it changes the original, pretty much with most elements for the better. It's not as long as other Atlas games at 30-ish hours, and doesn't overstay its welcome while having tons of charm. 8.5 out of 10. Can't wait for a potential second game remaster. Absolum is probably one of my top 5 releases of this year overall, as it really nails that combat in a way that you have to seriously try. A beat 'em up with indie roguelike elements that really itches that one more run. Co-op is an incredible way to experience the game, and I'm looking forward to any new content they are planning to release. 9 out of 10. Kingdoms of the Dump is an old school callback, as it really is like playing a 1990s JRPG, but expect the quality to dip past its halfway mark. I would recommend waiting for more patches, as its bugs may be faulty enough to sour your experience. But if you want to play an old school style RPG that makes up for its faults in charm and style, then it's almost worth it. I took about 30 hours or so to beat it with half of the side content, and I had a lot of fun with it. So yeah, these are the ones that stood out the most to me this year, as there were a few that I bought but haven't really got around to play yet. I was considering titles such as Elden Ring Night Rain and Battlefield 6, but ultimately I decided to hold off on those for now. There were many updates and DLCs for games I played that took up a lot of my time, looking at you, Gunfire Reborn, Tekken 8, Dark Tide, Sulphur, and so on, and playing some games that were not released in 2025, such as Dragon Quest XI. What games have you bought or can recommend that have been released in 2025, or just generally overall? I'd like to know, as I'm interested in chasing new experiences. Thank you for watching, as I'd like you to subscribe. But that's it from me. See ya.